Last week, Tom, we started down this path of international taxes and corporate tax rates. And
Yeah, but Dave, we made it damn interesting.
We did. And in particular, you told this story last week about Tamrat Lane.
Yeah, Tamrat Lane.
Tamrat Lane, who was the communist guerrilla-led dictator, or leader of the guerrillas.
Yep, and he became prime minister.
Okay.
Of Ethiopia.
Was it? I just assumed it was dictator. I didn't know it was a prime minister.
And it's very interesting when they took over, when they took power through a coup. Oh, they had multiple officials, and it wasn't clear like who was the real grand. They had a president, they had a prime minister, they had all of these top executive officers. But that was his title, prime minister, from 1991 to 1994. And that's when he was arrested and placed in an Ethiopian prison where he spent the next 12 years.
Right. It would have been interesting to see the set. I mean, I think about settings. And actually, we're going to touch on this. So I'm going to tell this little story. I might have told this before on a podcast. But when Israel was created, right? So Tamrat Lane, he brings his guerrillas up into the mountains in Ethiopia. And they're making these plans and they're reading Hegel and Marx and everything. Yep. Up in caves. They're living in caves in Ethiopia.
Foraging for food. Right. I mean,
God only knows what their life was like. And I contrast that with David Ben-Gurion when the state of Israel was being formed. Mm-hmm. He was so concerned that it looked professional that he actually personally rented tuxedos for every man in the room to look professional during the signing of documents, so that all the pictures being taken had all the men. I mean, most of these people were coming from the Holocaust. They had nothing. They were skinny. Health was terrible.
Impoverished.
Yep. They left everything behind and they fled to Israel. But he wanted them to look professional. So he actually goes out and he rented, I think, 300 tuxedos.
Wow.
With the help of Golda Meir, to make sure everybody looked professional. So a little bit of a difference when you're trying to form a government peacefully, when you're trying to form a government without war versus a bunch of guys planning an attack in a cave.
Running down from the mountains, literally, with guns and shooting,
How many people are you willing to kill? Okay, we'll make you president. How many people are you willing to kill? Oh, that's not enough. You're going to be a lower level.
I'm just going to add in this detail. In typical communist fashion, remember, communism is one variety of progressive central planning.
Right.
So is fascism, so is socialism. They're all central planning. They're versions of it. And so these communists in Ethiopia, when they displace the prior communist government. The prior government is called the Derg. It's an Amharic word that just means committee. That was the government formed by the Soviet Union back in the 70s. And the Soviets leave. Tamrat and his communist allies, comrades, I guess is the word, form a new government. And in typical progressive form, they appoint ministers for basically every area of life. Mm-hmm. So there's an agriculture minister, right? There's a minister of education. There's a minister of transportation. There's a minister of healthcare. Everything people are going to need, right? The minister is the head central planner.
That's how they choose who gets paid and
that's right.
who eats grass.
That's right.
Probably the same thing in North Korea today.
They're identifying who's going to get bribed.
Right. So this was just kind of random. So we do the podcast, and a few days later, I'm having a conversation with my dad over lunch, and I said I didn't know this whole story about Tamrat Lane. Do you know the story about Tamrat Lane? He says, yeah, I know a little bit. My dad's a real history guy, loves that kind of stuff. And he says, do you know about Operation Solomon? And all of a sudden, our podcast leads to this whole other conversation that I found fascinating. And I just thought we'd spend a few minutes at the beginning today. I wanted to share the rest of the story. So Operation Solomon was the attempt to help Ethiopian Jews, black Ethiopian Jews, to move to Israel in May of 1991.
Okay.
So we're talking about a week before Tamrat Lane takes power.
Yes.
And apparently during this 36-hour period, and that week right before, about a week right before, with a little help from George H.W. Bush, the Israeli Air Force, along with a number of commercial pilots, airlifted over 14,000 Ethiopian Jews in 36 hours.
Wow.
Out of Ethiopia to Israel and made them citizens. Some interesting things happened on these flights.
I can imagine.
Still to this day, one of those airliners, it was an El Al airplane. Okay. It was a 747. There were 1,088 passengers.
Wow.
On that one plane, the minute it took off, there were 1,090 passengers when it landed. Two babies born on the plane during flight. And you can imagine, I mean, the stress and the everything going on, a lot of times that'll induce pregnancy. I later found out watching it. So my dad tells me all this, and I start watching documentaries. I want to learn all about this.
Yeah.
Later found out there were 7 additional babies born on the tarmac while they were waiting for the plane to get on the plane. So 9 new children born either in Ethiopia
newborn
right
babies.
Before. And they
or
put
in
them
the air.
They put them in little incubators, and they had a whole section on the plane. And the planes were, I mean, they were worried about disease. They were worried about all of these things. So 14,000 Jews airlifted out.
Ethiopian Jews.
So I go back.
Why are all these Jews in Ethiopia, Dave?
We don't know. That's the problem. There are so many stories. Some say there's long been the story of the lost tribes of Israel. That we're talking thousands of years ago.
Right.
When some Jews ended up as slaves in Egypt, some Jews ended up enslaved by the Romans in other ways.
Maybe this tribe took a different turn.
They fled south.
And they end up in Ethiopia.
So they flee south. They end up in Ethiopia, but they are practicing Jews. They are they read the Torah. Very different. It's actually in book form. It's not scrolls like I grew up with. It's in book form, written on lambskin, but everything's the same. And they grow up reading these stories. So I'm watching some of these documentaries, and I find all these fascinating things about this. First of all, up until I think they said the mid to late 1860s.
Okay. Around the time of the American Civil War.
Around the time of the American Civil War. Before that, Ethiopian Jews didn't realize there were other Jews in the world.
That's great.
Think about what that means.
Yeah.
They thought they were the last of this group. There were all the stories that when they, from the 1400s, the 1500s, the 1600s, of mass executions of Jews in Ethiopia, in Somalia, in Chad, in the Sudan, in the surrounding countries by Muslims and by Christians. So they were under the impression that they were the last remaining Jews on the earth.
Amazing.
That also made them think that all Jews were black.
Because am I correct? I don't know any Ethiopian Jews.
I've known a few.
Am I correct? Are Ethiopian Jews, they have black skin?
Very dark skin.
Okay.
Very, very, very dark skin.
Yeah.
I'm thinking through this whole thing, and I'm watching this documentary. Fast forward to 1948.
Okay. Yep.
The Jews are starting to get wind that there are other Jews in the world.
Right.
They have no idea, though. There's no news. They have no idea what's happening. They have no idea the Holocaust is happening.
So 1948, World War II has just concluded.
Right.
The Allies are victorious. And one of the things they do is they create a new sovereign nation, the State of Israel.
Right. So the Ethiopian Jews are telling these stories, and there were a lot of elders on this documentary, or one of the documentaries, who were telling the stories about what they knew in the 20s and the 30s when they were children, and they had just heard stories of Israel. They didn't know anybody lived there. They didn't know if it was inhabited. They didn't know what was going on.
Yeah.
But the Torah tells about Israel as the city of gold.
Right.
So they imagined golden paved streets and the land. I mean, it was, for them, that was the land of opportunity, like America was for so many other people at the time.
I want our listeners to envision this, right? So people in Ethiopia, Ethiopian Jews in the 1920s and 30s, they're reading stories that are 3,000 years old about Israel as a kind of land of Oz.
Right.
Something like
Essentially,
that, right?
yes.
Yeah.
That they believe is their land.
Right.
Because it's the land of the Jews, and they think it's their mission, it's their purpose to one day find their way back to Israel.
Right.
But they don't know how to get there. They don't really have there's no maps, you have to remember how these African tribes and Ethiopia was just this land of tribalism.
Yes.
You have to think about how little they had. I mean, they weren't sitting there studying atlases and getting access to books and the Soviet dictators weren't certainly not.
Keep in mind that what probably the single greatest force that shaped the entire globe, in terms of human beings at that time, were wars of religious persecution.
Right.
Jews were taking the brunt. There's Muslim persecution, there's Christian persecution, and so a relatively small number of Jews in Ethiopia would have very good reasons to basically stay to themselves and not wander out very far.
They built fences around their walls. Nobody was really coming in.
Right.
To try to hurt them. I mean, they weren't doing them any favors. Nobody was taking care of them. Nobody was providing anything. Nobody would trade with them. They had to stay mostly self-sufficient.
Yeah.
But they built fences to tell their children and even for themselves, you don't leave our fence line.
Right.
You will get killed. That was their belief. You will get killed if you leave our village.
Yep.
So they're going through all of this. Israel becomes a state in 1948. 1949-ish. Israel gets an ambassador to Ethiopia. Israel's trying to make peace with the Soviets, and the Soviets are controlling Ethiopia at the time. And the Soviets say, yes, you can have an ambassador to Ethiopia. And he was a light-skinned Middle Easterner. He wasn't white, but he was a light-skinned Middle Easterner. Yes, he was Jewish.
He's a light-skinned Israeli Jew going to Ethiopia,
who had just survived the Holocaust.
Okay, right.
He wasn't born in Israel. He wasn't That was the British mandate at the time. So he was probably Soviet in all likelihood.
Right.
And he goes down to Ethiopia, and the first thing he does is he decides I'm gonna go visit these Jewish tribes that he's heard so much about, never met, and he walks in and. I mean, you could imagine the glass shattering in the minds of all of these. They looked at him, and these elders were recalling that moment of what it was like.
You can't be a Jew.
Watching
you're
this.
Not black.
Right, you're not
That's
black. Wait, you're from Russia?
Right.
You're a Soviet Jew?
Right.
All of these things.
You're not Ethiopian? Oh, that's great. What a great story.
And so all of a sudden, they start making plans. They don't speak the same language. Ethiopians didn't speak much Hebrew. They read Hebrew, but they didn't. It wasn't like a common language.
Right.
So they had to figure out how to communicate. But once they did, the Ethiopians said, all our lives, all of our ancestors' lives, all they've wanted for 500 years is to get back, move back to Israel. Will you help us? We want out of Ethiopia. This is a miserable life. He starts showing them books and all of these things and what the Western world was like. I mean, remember, Israel's really the only Western country in that region. And he starts showing them what the Western world is like. And so in the 1950s, they start slowly, very slowly, one small C-130, I think they're called, the military transport planes.
Right.
One at a time, every couple of weeks, would slowly bring some families out of Ethiopia and bring them to Israel. Along comes the 80s.
Yep.
And the Soviet Union is starting to fall, and Israel realizes the deal they have with the Soviets to continue to bring these Ethiopians back to Israel, their time is running out. And they start trying to work things out. Soviets end up leaving Ethiopia, and Mengistu is the leader before Tamrat took over.
Right.
And Mengistu has no money. He is the communist leader of this country, but has no money and no supplies and no way to keep his ministers fed and his ministers happy, to keep lining their pockets, the army's pockets, to keep fighting for him. And he's desperate. So he decides, I'm going to cut off all of the access for Israel to keep removing Ethiopian Jews and bringing them back to Israel.
Basically hold those Ethiopian Jews as hostages.
They became hostages.
Yeah.
And they came with a ransom. $180 million.
Okay.
And Israel says no. Israel says that's unreasonable. We're not going to keep you in power. We would rather you fall and we'll come in and do what we need to do. It shows the desperation. That 180 million quickly turned into 30 to 35 million.
Right.
Israel accepts. And they say, but we're going to do this fast. We're going to start bringing in a lot more planes. We're going to start, and they start months of planning, starting the very, very beginning of 1991, or even maybe the late 1990.
Yeah.
And they're planning this whole thing. They're working with George H.W. Bush. They're trying to get everything ready. And then they go to make the payment, and Mengistu's nowhere to be found. He has fled the country.
Yep.
He had no money. His army started to turn on him. So they said, okay, how about your finance minister? You still have a finance minister? We'll give the money to the finance. It's $30 million.
Right.
For these lives. We will happily pay that.
Tell us who to give the money to.
Finance minister's gone. They start going through this and going through this and going through this. Finally, they found somebody.
They should have called me. I could have connected them to Tamrat. He would have taken their money.
Would
yeah.
have. Although he might have shot you at that
well,
time.
Maybe,
that was before his 12 years in jail. Like you told me, you first thing you thought about when you sat down with Tamrat is how many people he gunned down with an AK-47.
Yeah, I told him. I said, I'm a little on edge here. I've never sat, at my kitchen table with someone who's done the things you've done.
So we think about this whole thing and all these people. So what ends up happening is they find somebody at the airport, essentially, to pay off.
To take the money, yeah.
They gave $30 million to whoever was in charge of the airport.
Yeah.
They brought in as many jets as they can. I think they brought in 28.
Okay.
And they end up airlifting these 14,000 Jews.
14,000 people.
Out of Israel, or out of Ethiopia, bringing them to Israel.
Yeah.
And it was interesting. There were conversations at the beginning about there was some racism, right? Some of the Ethiopian Jews. A lot of the Jews, they had just come through the Holocaust. They had never met a black Jew before. They didn't know. They were being very protective of their new
And I'm
home.
assuming a lot of those black Ethiopian Jews lived in such seclusion from the rest of the world, they didn't even know much about the Holocaust, if anything.
They didn't know it even happened.
Yeah.
And on top of that, they were uneducated. They couldn't do jobs. I mean,
Right.
there was a big disparity.
Yep.
One of the cool things about one of these documentaries was how sort of it's taken one or two generations, but because of the way that Israeli society is structured very much on Western values, American values, it only took a generation or two for a lot of these. And they were interviewing some of these people. They were dressed so nicely. They owned businesses. They were showing their Ethiopian restaurants or their storefronts or the different things that they do
I'm
throughout
confident
Israel.
that story of those Ethiopian Jews immigrating to Israel is very similar to the story of many immigrants coming to the United States. People will sacrifice, come here with almost nothing.
Yep.
And within a generation or two, either their kids or their grandkids are living pretty comfortable middle-class lives. They're living in a nice house, running a business, sending their kids off to college, doing those sorts of things.
And that attitude, as I understand it, and I can't speak, I haven't spent significant time in Israel in over 20 years.
Right.
It's almost been 25 now. So I don't know, I can't speak, but the best I understand, there isn't much racism when it comes to black Jews in Israel. That sort of stigma is gone. And I think a lot of that can be attributed to this attitude of those Ethiopian Jews of just saying, oh my God, like we're finally in Israel. We're finally free. We're finally, we can look at all these things around us. And if we learn how to use them, and they wanted to build their own businesses and they wanted to become self-reliant and all the values that we teach, all the virtues of being a good citizen, they really embraced. It was this freeing opportunity
It's an
latched
amazing
onto.
thing, that hope of freedom, that promise of freedom, which so many Americans today. This is one of the frustrating things about the progressive culture we live in, because so many progressive Americans today just dismiss freedom as this sort of silly, uninteresting, unimportant, almost naive. You silly, stupid, patriotic people who talk about freedom. Who cares about freedom? Typical progressive Americans will immediately shift the discussion to, what about this person over here? He's sick right now and he can't afford health care.
Right.
What kind of program are we going to have to make sure he has health? And just skip right past that whole notion of freedom. And yet, throughout most of human history, this has been the driving force. This has been the thing that people valued more than anything else, is that promise of freedom.
And what if there was a version of critical race theory in Israel at the time?
Right.
Who said, look, you people from Ethiopia, you're never going to be successful.
Right.
You have no hope. You're never going to be smart enough to learn what we know. It's going to take you generations and generations and generations to catch up.
Yep.
So don't bother. Don't even try. Don't come to
become
our
wards of the
schools.
state.
Just we'll take care of you.
Yeah.
You'll live, but you'll only live this well, and
Yep.
that'll have to be enough for you, because that's still a lot better than what you had
Right.
before. And it was just the opposite. You had such this idea of people coming in and saying, well, wait a minute. I have other skill sets. I have other things that I learned how to do, having to grow up in Ethiopia, having to fend for myself, having to grow crops in arid Africa or dry Africa.
Right.
And all of these things, and they became part of society.
Well, and and it's interesting because effectively, I mean, there are differences in details, but basically the exact same story unfolded right here in the United States.
Right.
After the Civil War, approximately 4 million enslaved men and women and their children become free. And what happens immediately after that, they become productive. They become self-reliant. It's both an amazing story and a sad story. And I might want to come back to this a little bit later in the podcast. In this period of American history filled with ugliness, that period after the Civil War, you have domestic terrorism in the form of the Ku Klux Klan and other groups sponsored by the Democratic Party. You have violent, extreme racism and racial discrimination in all kinds of ways. That's just ugly. And yet, in the face of that, former slaves, people who themselves, they were slaves, and the sons and the daughters of former slaves start flourishing and prospering.
Right.
And they're building houses and they're building schools for their children and they're building hotels and restaurants and clothing stores and all the things that people want to live a better life.
Yep.
It's the same story. It's amazing that Black Americans, by virtually every metric, were flourishing more, prospering more in the 1920s with all that ugliness going on than they are in the 2020s.
Yeah.
There's also another fascinating connection, that story you just told of this Ethiopian Jews really not knowing about the Holocaust, not just kind of closed off from the outside world, not really understanding everything that was going on. Another similar thing happens in the course of the Civil War here, and it leads to this historical event that was just formalized into a national holiday, Juneteenth.
It's pretty ironic that this all kind of came together this week, right?
Yeah, it really did. Was it? I believe it was last week that President Biden signed into law a bill that had passed both the House and the Senate to commemorate Juneteenth, which is short for June 19th, as a national holiday. And in that case, this was in the summer, in June of 1865. A United States Army general announced he was in Texas, and there were a few 100,000 black slaves who were legally no longer slaves. And the problem, they didn't know it.
Right.
They didn't know that Abraham Lincoln had declared issued the Emancipation Proclamation, or that the Civil War had come to a conclusion. They simply didn't know. And so he announces, I think he was headquartered, if I remember, in Galveston, down on the Gulf Coast of Texas. And so he begins by reading aloud to the local people in Galveston, Texas, you who have been living as slaves, you're no longer slaves. And there's been some curious discussion and controversy around Juneteenth. One of the things I want to do is just kind of lay out a basic timeline that I think might help our listeners understand that whole story. A lot of people don't know about Juneteenth and
absolutely
what it means, and also what it doesn't mean. So first we have to back up a little bit.
Before you do that, let's just tie these two stories together real quick and put a bow on that first one. I want people to really think about that. It's basically the same thing. You have groups of people who wanted freedom, who wanted to be somewhere, were told you're not allowed to. They were held hostage, and some strange person that they had never seen before, that they didn't know existed, who they didn't know was actually on their side, right? Every person like that they had ever encountered before had been a slaver, had been somebody who intending to harm them, or at least in their perception was most likely interested in harming them.
Right.
And they had somebody come to them and say, wait a minute, there's a better opportunity for you. You don't have to live like this anymore. We're gonna do what we can to make sure you don't live like this anymore. That connection, it happened, 120 years apart, a little bit more.
Right.
But it's like the same story.
Yeah.
So
it's a beautiful story.
Right. So go ahead with your timeline. As I'm sitting there watching these documentaries, I couldn't get past the similarities, and it was just so ironic that it happened this week.
It is. It's a beautiful coincidence. So in the case of sort of the main historical background to understand Juneteenth, we have to rewind, go back to the middle of the Civil War in late 1862. Abraham Lincoln is president. He's in his first term. The Civil War is raging. It's terrible. It's violent. The death tolls are racking up. And there had been a number of people were leaning on Lincoln to say, just declare all the slaves to be free. Now, it got complicated because Lincoln was very conscious of the constitutional limitations of his power. And one of the interesting features of the Civil War that is very often forgotten is not all the slave states were in rebellion against the Union. There were 4 of them that had stayed.
Right.
Kentucky was a slave state. It was part of the Union. Delaware was a slave state. There weren't many slaves there, but slavery was legal. Maryland was a slave state. These were all states that were still part of the Union. And so as president, Lincoln said, those are internal state laws there, according to their state constitutions. I, as president, I don't have any constitutional power. No president had any constitutional power to just say slavery's now illegal in Delaware or Kentucky.
Just a little tangent on that. It's a little ironic that you bring that up, just because right now in Congress, they're discussing federal election laws. And they want to nationalize the election process and the rules for elections.
Yeah.
It's interesting that something so crucial to our Declaration of Independence, to the American idea, Lincoln still wasn't willing to violate the Constitution to accomplish.
Right.
And yet today
doesn't matter.
Forget it. This isn't even the whole idea of federalism. This isn't even something that's intricate to our founding.
Right.
They're not reaching for the American idea by trying to nationalize our election process.
That's right.
And yet forget federalism.
Yeah, the Constitution makes it very clear that Congress has only very specific, limited, enumerated powers, and all the other powers are left to the states. Such as the power to make laws about voting and elections. How exactly should an election happen? The Constitution gives to Congress no power to make those decisions. It leaves that entirely up to, so here in Colorado, the state of Colorado decides how an election should be run. And in other states, in California, they make their rules. In New York, they make theirs, right? In different states that you choose on their own. And it was the same way with slavery.
Right.
So back to the Civil War. Now, Lincoln despises slavery his entire life, and he made it very clear that His grand purpose was to place slavery in the course of ultimate extinction. He wants to get rid of it, but he wants to do it in a way that upholds the Constitution. He doesn't want to destroy the Constitution. And so he issues the Emancipation Proclamation as an executive order, and he justifies it according to his war powers in a time of war.
Okay.
So the Emancipation Proclamation declaring slaves to be free applies only to those places that are in open, armed military rebellion against the Union. So it only applies to Confederate states like South Carolina and Alabama and Georgia and Texas, which was part of the Confederate States of America. And there's a wrinkle. He declares these slaves to be free, but he doesn't have the power to free them, because in most of those Southern Confederate states, the Union Army is not there, so there's nobody there to enforce the Emancipation Proclamation. He declares this in September of 1862, and he gives the Confederates 100 days to basically stop the rebellion. He says this Emancipation Proclamation is going to take effect January 1, 1863, and any states that are still in rebellion, your slaves, we are declaring your slaves to be free. If you stop the rebellion, this Emancipation Proclamation won't apply to you. You can continue with your domestic institutions, which would have included slavery, as long as you return to the Union under the Constitution. Well, of course, no Confederate states took up his offer, and he declares all the slaves to be free in the rebelling Southern states. What that does is it effectively transforms the Union Army into the greatest liberating force in all of human history, because where the Army goes, it leaves in its wake thousands, eventually millions of freed slaves. Right. In fact, I'll recommend here a friend of mine, Alan Gelzo, who's one of the best historians of the Civil War, has written a beautiful book specifically on the Emancipation Proclamation, and I highly recommend it to people who are interested in this. So there's the big event. Lincoln has issued the Emancipation Proclamation. He has declared all the slaves to be free in Confederate states, which includes the state of Texas. That's part of the CSA, the Confederate States of America. Now, fast forward to 1865. Okay, 1865. Lincoln he's been reelected. Right. He's in his second term, just starting it. In April, a couple of decisive things happen. April, this is the sort of the timeline here I want people to understand. April 9th is when Robert E. Lee, the highest ranking officer of the Confederate Army, surrenders at Appomattox Courthouse to Ulysses S. Grant. Effectively, from a military point of view, the war is over. This will take some time for the news to travel, for the other parts of the armies to learn this, but the highest ranking officer of the Confederacy, he's given up. Yep. He's done. It's over. Now that's April 9th. Just 5 days later, Abraham Lincoln is assassinated. Think about it. People forget this. Lincoln got to enjoy victory for 5 days. And John Wilkes Booth blasts a bullet into his brain on the night of the 14th, April 14th. Lincoln dies early the next morning on the 15th. Fast forward 2 more months to June of 1865, and a United States Army general named Granger, is his last name, Gordon Granger, I believe. He marches down to Texas, and he realizes there are several 100,000 slaves, which included many slave owners from Mississippi and Louisiana. The Union had taken over Louisiana. They had fled, and they had headed to Texas so that they could continue their slave-based lifestyle. And he issues a general order, number 3, and reads it and orders it to be distributed, saying, all of you slaves, you've been free since Abraham Lincoln issued his emancipation 2.5 years ago. You are free men and women. You're no longer slaves. Now, here's the curious. That's what Juneteenth celebrates. Is that United States Army officer who I believe had white skin.
Yeah.
When BLM members tell white people you don't belong as part of Juneteenth, well, Juneteenth happened because of issues given by a white United States Army officer who was enforcing an executive order, the Emancipation Proclamation, issued by a white president of the United States. But here's the curious thing. Many people, it certainly is worth celebrating. We should celebrate Juneteenth. What a wonderful thing for all these people living as slaves who didn't realize they had been freed, and to let them know it's an Emancipation Day. You're free. You're no longer slaves. That's wonderful. It's not the formal end of slavery, though, because in those Union states like Delaware and Maryland, slavery was still legal, even after the Civil War, after Lincoln is dead. We don't abolish slavery formally until we get the 13th Amendment ratified, which doesn't happen until December 6th of 1865. And once the 13th Amendment, it passed through Congress earlier in the year, and that was Lincoln's. I mean, Lincoln threw every ounce of energy he had into making sure that the 13th Amendment passed both chambers of Congress with the sufficient 2/3 majority that it needed. In fact, there was a great movie that came out, I don't know, 10 years ago, 8 years ago. In fact, I think it was Steven Spielberg. It was just titled Lincoln.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, and there's a famous actor.
Daniel Day-Lewis.
Yes, Daniel Day-Lewis plays Lincoln. And that whole movie is the story of just those few weeks there toward the end when Lincoln is trying to get, and other Republicans, to get the 13th Amendment through Congress. Then it has to go to the states. It has to be ratified by 3/4 of the states. That process doesn't happen until December. Lincoln's dead. He's been assassinated by then. That constitutionally puts an end to legalized slavery everywhere, not just in Confederate states, but in the Union states as well.
So Biden's term, what they called this new holiday, Juneteenth Independence Day, is that
the official title, and there's some controversy about this, rightfully so. The official title that Congress gave it is Juneteenth National Independence Day. That is the official title of this new holiday, Juneteenth National Independence Day. Some members of Congress, like Ron Johnson from up in Wisconsin, he pushed back. He said, well, wait a minute, this name doesn't make sense because we have an Independence Day. We celebrate on July 4th. That's Independence Day. This should be a different name. And I actually agree with him. Something like Juneteenth Emancipation Day might make more sense, or something like that.
But take it a step further. It's not even accurate, because it really wasn't until December 6th.
That is right.
That the slaves were free.
That's right. The real celebration for ending legalized slavery throughout the United States is with the ratification of the 13th Amendment, and that happened December 6th, 1865.
You could call it Texas Emancipation Day.
Yeah. It's basically slaves in Texas learning that they're no longer slaves day.
Let's play this whole thing out. I'm going to go back to my original story. You have governments wanting to control people, because that's what governments inherently like to do, especially when they don't have a constitution to control that.
Let me just add to that. Lincoln pointed out more than one occasion that slavery could not last a day, an hour, a minute, or a second if it didn't have the sanction and support of government and laws.
Right.
If you didn't have government involved, if you didn't have laws legalizing slavery, someone might try to enslave another person, but the other people are going to push back.
They didn't have
it's not going to last. That's right.
Right. And what you end up getting is slaughter, not slavery.
That's right.
Eventually, people start pushing back, and then you start killing them.
That's right.
To make them too afraid to push back.
That's right.
Which we saw in the Holocaust, which we saw in Mao's China, which we saw under Lenin and Stalin and Genghis Khan, and I mean, go as far back as you want. So you have two governments who want to maintain control, who are aware of events happening outside of the immediate purview of their constituents. And I use that term very, very loosely, right? Texas slaves.
Hostages is a better term.
Hostages, okay. So things happening outside of the purview of their hostages.
Yep.
And they're lying to them about it.
Yeah.
Because they want to keep control over them.
Or at a minimum, concealing.
Right.
Not sharing with them the information and the news that's happening.
You had Mengistu
Yes.
not telling the Ethiopian Jews, oh, by the way, you have a country now. If you want to leave, they're even willing to come pick you up and fly you.
Right. They'll give you a ride.
They'll give you a ride.
Yeah.
Can't tell them that. We need them for money. We need them for hostages.
Yep.
And you have the
Texas.
Democrats
Yep.
in the governor's mansion
Yep.
and in the legislature in
Yep.
Texas
Yep.
not telling their slaves, oh,
You're free.
by the way, we lost the war.
Yeah.
And by the way, there's no more slavery in the United States or in these southern states.
In that sense, there were somewhere around 250,000 black-skinned slaves in Texas. They really were hostages at that point. The war was over. The Emancipation Proclamation had been issued 2.5 years earlier. They were not legally slaves, but they were certainly being held as hostages by force.
It's unbelievable how I think today about how people say, well, you know, our whole for July, we're going to get into our case study for July, and I don't want to go too much into that, but we talk about regulation.
Yeah.
And we talk about who you should trust in this world. Should you trust your neighbor or should you trust your government? And it's shocking to me that despite all this evidence, that we still have people out there saying, well, you got to trust your government. Your government's there to take care of you. Your government is trustworthy. You can trust that. Meanwhile, we had 2.5 years in Texas where the Democrats lied to the slaves and said, nope, you're still slaves. And if you try to run away, we're going to shoot you.
Yep.
If you try to run away, we're going to beat you. We're going to whip you. We're going to violate your rights.
Yep.
And this goes back to an important part you always talk about when you explain the American idea. And that is when that slave is holding onto that tree and is being whipped, they still have their rights. It doesn't mean
That's right.
It does not mean that they don't have rights. It means those rights are being violated.
That's right.
It's what makes them wrong.
So what makes that whipping or beating wrong?
Right.
Absolutely. And the glorious thing, this again is something. This whole notion, this whole historical event of Juneteenth, it should be held up as a thing to be celebrated by all Americans. All Americans, of all skin colors, of all. Well, in fact, if anyone has a reason not to celebrate it, it would be Democrats, because it might be kind of embarrassing for them. Because what Joe Biden just did, Joe Biden is a lifelong Democrat. He and his Democratic allies just made a holiday about recognizing ending democratic enslavement of black people. They turned that into a holiday.
He made a holiday out of about a day that Democrats got caught in a lie.
That's right. That's
right.
It's absolutely right.
Freedom-oriented people complain all the time about the hypocrisy of the left, and they lie about this and they lie about that and they prioritize this, and it was actually funny. There was a conversation this week. Interesting, I guess. We did a whole episode about Rush Limbaugh when he passed away, and this week the new hosts of that time slot took over. And this week I was listening one morning, and they were actually having a conversation about how it was Brian.
Should we share with people that you and I turned that offer down? That's how those guys got that job.
Still hoping maybe one day we find the time, we can work it into our busy schedules. Who was the news anchor? Brian Wallace? Was that his name? Not
Mike Wallace.
No,
Chris Wallace.
Chris Wallace is the Fox anchor. Who was the anchor who lied about getting shot at in Iraq?
Is that Dan Rather?
No, it was
Brian Jennings?
Maybe.
Yeah. So many of them have made up so many stories.
But he got fired.
Yeah.
He got fired. He said, I got shot at in Iraq, had to run to a helicopter and made this whole story up.
Right.
And turned out to be fake, and they fired him over this. And Hillary Clinton said the same thing, and it was a lie. She said, I got shot at in Iraq.
Right.
And she didn't, and they almost elected her president, right?
Right.
And they were making the point that people expect politicians to lie, so it's okay. People don't expect journalists to lie, or don't want journalists to lie, so they fire them.
Right.
It was this sort of whole conversation. But this was an opportunity. We get so frustrated about it. And he actually just created a holiday that everybody's going to celebrate every year. Yes, the name is terrible. The name makes no sense. The name was probably invented by the people on the 1619 Project.
You mean the full title?
The full title
Juneteenth National Independence Day.
Yeah, is a terrible name because it doesn't even make it doesn't even explain what the holiday is.
Let's be real clear. There was no act of national independence on June 19th, 1865.
Right.
So in that sense, the name of the holiday is very misleading.
But he literally just created a holiday for all of us to say, oh, you mean the day that the Democrats got caught lying to their slaves?
Yeah. You're
it.
absolutely right.
And I say that because I was shocked at how many people on our side who believe in freedom said, I can't believe these Republicans in Congress who voted to approve this holiday. I can't believe we made this a holiday. This is wrong. I refuse to recognize. I said, what a great opportunity. And they're, well, it's too close to the 4th of July, or it's too close to Father's Day. They're trying to replace Father's Day, and it's too close to Memorial Day, and they're trying to replace.
No,
you can't control when the day
it's a glorious historical event that is worth celebrating, and it should be. This is what I was saying just a few minutes ago. It should be held up and celebrated by all Americans of all skin colors, of all persuasions, because what it represents was a big stride forward in the American effort to reach the American idea, to live up to the American idea. It was a big step closer to it, to realizing those principles in the Declaration of Independence, taking that idea of universal natural equality, natural rights, and getting our policies and our laws and our practices to line up with that idea. And it's surprising to me that, number one, Democrats want to celebrate it because it's a very embarrassing, shameful thing for Democrats. It's also surprising to me that more Republicans don't want to. It tells me many Republicans don't fully understand their own history, the history of the Republican Party, because that story of abolishing slavery in the United States in basically 2 generations after the American founding, that story is a Republican story.
Right.
With Abraham Lincoln in the White House and the key generals in the Union Army, all Republican, they're the ones who actually put an end to this heinous institution against violent, vehement, even sneaky, underhanded opposition from Democrats.
Well, it tells me also that too many people on both sides of the aisle believe in this myth that the parties switched at one point in our history, right? So how can you celebrate something that was a Republican victory in 1865 if the parties switched?
Right.
It's fake. It's a myth. A little teaser for our members. We will be telling that story sooner than later and giving you the tools to be able to talk about that myth.
I'll throw out one little nugget here. If that was true, the Republican Party was formed to preserve the principles of the Declaration of Independence and to change our laws, our policies, our practices to reflect those principles. That's what the early Republicans did. That's what Lincoln did. That's why Gordon Granger was issuing General Orders Number 3 on June 19th, 1865. If the parties really switched, then that would mean a bunch of Democrats today would be upholding the principles of the Declaration of Independence, equal individual rights, equal protection under the laws. And I would challenge anyone to find a Democrat today who will uphold the ideas of the Declaration of Independence, who will uphold the idea of natural liberty, of private property, of equal protection of the laws for all citizens rather than tribalism and group-based preferences and discrimination.
Right. I mean, the man who we talked about earlier, who wanted to put slavery on the path to ultimate extinction, but still wouldn't violate the Constitution in his approach in doing it. And he said, I'm going to do it constitutionally. I'm going to do it correctly. I'm going to do it appropriately based on our Constitution. He cared so much about it.
Yeah.
That's the party today that says the Constitution was racist and we shouldn't even recognize it. It
or
doesn't
the
make any
Constitution
sense.
is a living document. And
Right.
We can just change what it means, right, with our whim.
Right. So, and I guess we should leave because it is so recent, and those conversations are going to happen. The other part of that conversation that I love to have with people when they tell me the party switched, first question I ask is, well, when did that happen? and the most common answer is the 1960s.
Yep.
Right. That's when most people say, because you can't say it happened during Reconstruction.
Right.
Right. So, because we know the Republicans were still in charge, and the Republicans they held the presidency, and then you had the KKK were definitely Democrats. Mm-hmm. So you can't say it was before Woodrow Wilson and FDR. So they eventually say that the 60s. Well, then why are they claiming Joe Biden as the heir to FDR?
Right.
If the party switched, wouldn't you reject everything that FDR stood for?
If the party switched, wouldn't modern Democrats today want to claim to be the heir of Calvin Coolidge?
Right. Can any Democrat today actually tell us what Calvin Coolidge believed in?
Right.
That's absolutely right. I mean, that's my go-to. Yeah. So if people are looking for ways to have that conversation, and somebody says they want to talk about Juneteenth, because I really hope they will. I really hope that people will go out and say, Juneteenth it's a good holiday to celebrate. I wouldn't call it Juneteenth National Independence Day or whatever it is. I would just say Juneteenth.
Yep.
It was a great day. It was the day the Democrats got caught lying to their slaves.
Yep, it's absolutely true.
They could no longer hold their slaves hostage.
Yep, and we are gonna address that whole subject of the party switch in great detail in a really special kind of presentation coming down the road. And Juneteenth, the connections there between, a group of slaves in the United States who didn't know they were free, and Operation Solomon in Ethiopia, a group of black Ethiopian Jews who had an opportunity to get to their homeland that they didn't really know existed. The connections are absolutely tremendous. And in both cases, once they were free, they went and flourished and prospered without any kind of special aid or assistance. Mm-hmm. This is a lesson for Americans to learn today. Freed slaves, children of slaves were flourishing in the early part of the 20th century, even against terrible discrimination. And I'm not in any way justifying the discrimination or the violence. I am saying, look at how resilient and creative these black Americans were in the face of hooded thugs and murderers and arsonists.
Yeah.
They could still flourish, and they had families, and they got married and stayed married and raised their children to be productive and educated. And it's as if we have forgotten that.
Yeah.
In modern progressive America today, half the country or more thinks, well, any American with black skin needs all kinds of subsidies, and they need to be coddled, and they need special kind of government programs. And it's a terrible injustice that we're engaged in.
I just wish I could have seen what this country could have been if there weren't all those injustices.
Yeah.
Because you're right. They had the opportunity to thrive, and it wasn't until the 1960s. A little bit in the 20s and 30s, early 40s with FDR, but finally under Lyndon Johnson, it was the limitations and the pushback put on those communities, what they could have done before that.
The progressive Great Society programs, subsidies and regulations did to black Americans what neither slavery nor Jim Crow nor the KKK could do. They broke down the family unit within black communities and created a culture of impoverishment and dependency.
Yep.
Slavery didn't do that. Jim Crow didn't do that. Progressive Great Society did, which is why it's more important really now than ever. Even though we're far removed from slavery, it's more important now than ever. We are in the Great Society. We are living in a progressive Great Society world. And it's more important to preserve and guard and remind fellow citizens of the ideas of freedom more than ever before,
right.
Which is why we need guardians.
Nos somos custodes. We
Till
will
next
be
time.
those guardians.